All right. UC Berkeley computer scientist Micah Carroll will help us understand manipulation via social media algorithms. Micah is a PhD student in artificial intelligence at UC Berkeley, working with Anka Dragan and another great Wonderfest speaker, Stuart Russell. Earlier at Cal, Micah earned an undergraduate degree in statistics and did research at the Center for Human-Compatible AI. Human-compatible AI. I shudder to think about the growing power of AI not being human-compatible. I imagine Micah will discuss that with us. Please welcome UC Berkeley computer scientist and Wonderfest Science Envoy, Micah Carroll.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Tucker. And yeah, I'm very excited to talk to you today about, I guess, some certain aspects of AI that don't seem to be very human compatible, that I guess are starting to emerge in some of our technologies today, in particular in recommender systems that are basically the algorithms that power most of social media. Also, I hope you can see and hear me correctly.
Doing well, Micah.
Okay.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. So, I mean, I don't know if any of you have a sense of how much social media people use per day on average around the world. And I found that, like, I found this number to be pretty surprising, but it's over 2 hours a day and almost 2 hours and a half per day. So this is already like almost a tenth of our life potentially is spent like interacting with these types of systems. And in particular, so in a sense, like the algorithms that decide what type of content we engage with on social media also play a big part in determining like this pretty significant chunk of our life. So anyways, recommender systems are these algorithms behind social media, are also in a bunch of other places, like they're across entertainment apps, e-commerce, music recommendation, news recommendation, dating recommendation. They're also the algorithms that power ad placement all across the web. So in a sense, like they really do affect a lot of the various aspects of our life, of what we consume, what we engage with, what we buy, the people that we end up spending very large portions of our life together with potentially. And so there's a lot of potential for benefiting us and society at large, but also a large potential for causing harm if there are problems in how these algorithms make their decisions. So just to reiterate what a recommender system is, a recommender system goes from basically is an algorithm that looks at the content corpus. So basically all the possible posts, all the possible videos that YouTube could recommend you, say, and it chooses which type of videos it should show you on your YouTube homepage. And so essentially it's trying to match up for a given person, which kind of content will that person engage with, or which type of content will that person click on, watch, share, retweet, send to their friends, whatever. So this is a main idea behind recommender systems, or what recommender systems do. So like the main goal here is for recommender systems is to try to infer from your data what is currently relevant and valuable to you. So essentially, this is kind of hard to translate in math. And everything that these algorithms do has to be translated in math at some point or another, because like all of these algorithms are like expressed in, well, logic of some kind or math of some kind, one could say. But this seems like a very hard concept to express in math. Like, what is valuable to you? What is relevant? And what people have settled with is just defining, well, saying, well, okay, what is valuable and relevant is essentially if you engage with something, if you click on it, if you watch it, then that's probably valuable to you and engaging and so on. And so really what this looks like in the end is you are shown what you are predicted to click on. And this clearly has some like failure cases are pretty obvious that one can think about. For example, if I show you a misleading headline about World War III having just started, you will probably click on it, but that doesn't mean that this content is valuable or relevant to you. In fact, it isn't. It's just a waste of your time. So this operationalization here of like how this concept, this goal that we have is translated into math, I guess, is definitely not quite correct. And that's like one of the root of the problems of these systems, but it's not the only one. Okay, so just to give you an example here, like, so, or just for as a overview, there's two main types of algorithms that exist out there for recommendation, or two big broad categories. One of them is like myopic systems, and this is using a technique called supervised learning that I won't go into. And another one are like more farsighted systems that use a technique called reinforcement learning. So just to give you a very, very brief like summary of what the distinction between these two systems is that most recent, like, or in the past, most systems were myopic. And what that means is that at any given point of time, they just give you the thing that you're most likely to click on. So they try to select content that you will click on right now. While instead, far-sighted systems try to plan out ways to keep you engaged throughout time. So they're trying to reason about how you will react to their recommendations, and like try to make sure that over the course of the next month, you will always be engaged, or be engaged as much as possible, rather than just be engaged right now. And so the hope with this type of system was that it maybe would not recommend clickbait, because if you always recommend clickbait, then that would not lead to long-term engagement. You start learning that, okay, this system is not very good. I don't want to be inundated by clickbait all the time. And so you would stop engaging. So yeah, here just in YouTube, this is just an example of like what recommendations can look like. You are watching a video, you see on the side here a bunch of other videos are recommended to you. Like these videos are selected by a recommender system. And in particular on YouTube, all the evidence points at the fact that they're currently using this new class of algorithms, are like far-sighted reinforcement learning algorithms. And I'll just briefly talk about why this is problematic, and we should really think about whether we should be using these types of algorithms at all, or like this second kind of algorithm at all. Okay, so the main issue behind like a lot of the field of recommendations is that one of the underlying assumptions in a lot of the algorithms that are being used is that users are static. But really, we are not static as users of these systems. Like our behavior changes, and this is accounted for by the field. But there's these other things are not really as accounted for. Like, for example, our psychological state, our mood changes, our beliefs about the world change, our preferences, our desires and aspirations change over time. And like these changes are in part due to outside factors. Like it might be that I just had a bad day, or I read a newspaper, like a physical newspaper article, and I changed my mind about something. And like they also might be due to like the other platform factors, such as just the UI of Twitter has changed, and I don't know, now it makes me approach the platform in a different way or something. But one thing that we're trying to like hone in on is the changes in like the user's internal state that are due to the recommender system algorithm itself. So like, how does the choice of content that the algorithm chooses to show you affect your behavior, your state, like your psychological state, your beliefs, your preferences? And in particular, we focus on this idea of preferences because it's particularly interesting in our research. Okay, so I guess in terms of these far-sighted systems or like reinforcement learning systems, what usually they're conceptualized as is there's this kind of loop between the recommender system that we show here as a little robot that is showing you content, and then you giving feedback to the recommender system as to whether this content's recommendation was good or not. So if you like on a video, you're basically telling the system, you did a good job. If you commented on it, same thing. If you just ignore it or you skip the video, then you're telling the recommender system, well, that was not a very good recommendation. And as I was mentioning earlier, there's been a lot of like new work in this space, trying to use these new types of recommenders, these farsighted systems for real world recommendation problems. In particular, YouTube almost certainly has started using this. And the idea is to try to like avoid the problem of clickbait and give users long-term discovery content. And there's been a bunch of work in this space recently. And a lot of people seem to be very excited about it. But this type of algorithm also has pretty clear problems if you like think about it a little bit more. And there's been also like some more recent work, including our own, which basically shows this theoretically. So in particular, if you're trying to, if this recommender system, this agent, this AI is trying to plan out how to keep you engaged over long time horizons, one way it can do so is by one clear way it can do so is by changing you to be more engaged over time. So if it learns how showing you specific types of content can change your beliefs or change your preferences or change your moods in ways that affect engagement downstream, then it will have an incentive to try to manipulate you and change you in those ways. For example, if showing you sad content or showing you angry content increases your engagement, and the system learns this pattern, it will try to always show you angry content so that you are engaged or keep engaged over time. Or potentially shifting your beliefs about certain topics can lead you to like more content that is available. And then it makes you easier to satisfy and easier to keep engaged. So essentially, with these types of new algorithms, the system will actively try to manipulate the user by default. And yeah, I think this is mostly not necessarily something that people have really thought about very much, or it's like pretty recent, this realization. So I don't think that the companies doing this necessarily were doing so maliciously, but it was definitely like profitable for them in the sense that yeah, YouTube reported like a pretty significant increase in engagement when they started using this new type of system. Okay, so the issue here is that the environment, or like what the AI system is interacting with, is our brain directly, essentially, or our mind. So because we usually want AI systems to modify the environments they're in, and that's fine in the sense that if you have an AI that's playing chess, the agent, like this AI agent, must change the board in order to win the game. But in this case, we are the board, like we are the chessboard, and the AI system is basically playing with our mind in order to get higher reward, or higher, yeah, getting higher performance essentially. Okay, so so I guess like one issue here is like what's the root cause of the problem? Well, the problem is this fact that the goal was to maximize the total user engagement over time. So, but there's no concept here of there should be a penalty on manipulating people or changing people's preferences. So in that sense, shifting somebody's preferences or their moods or their beliefs is assumed to be intrinsically valueless. Like there's no cost or no benefit to this in its own right. And sometimes, though, there might be a benefit to changing these things in order to get more downstream performance or more downstream long-term engagement. Yeah, so even if it's a result of manipulation, currently these systems don't have any penalty for this type of behavior. Okay, and like clearly this seems like problematic to, I think, most people just instinctively, because we care about agency over our preference change. So we don't want an AI system to like play with our mind in this way necessarily, right? And yeah, as I was mentioning, this is not just about preferences, but it also applies to moods and beliefs and so on. Okay, so there's a question maybe about whether this type of manipulation stuff happens in practice quite yet. So there's no direct, like it hasn't been demonstrated quite yet, even though, I don't know, that's part of my research, I don't know, my research goals for my next couple of projects. But there's definitely some unknowns. Like in some, like we don't know how manipulable are we? Like we're probably somewhat manipulable. Hard to say exactly how much. There's also a question of like whether our systems have enough context to figure out how we change our preferences and beliefs and use that to their advantage. And we don't really know whether like how much they can do so. But there's one study that was done like various years ago at this point, in 2014 by Facebook, that some of you might have heard about before, in which Facebook basically changed the feed of some of the users by basically showing them posts that were more happy or only happy posts, or other people, they only showed them sad posts for some period of time. And what they saw and what like they were able to measure, that for the people that saw happy posts, they were also a lot happier in their types of posts and so on. So it affected them in a positive way. And for the people that were shown sad posts, it made them, like it affected them in a negative way. So it made them sadder than they would have been otherwise. And so what this shows to me, at least, is that even with very simple changes in the algorithm or in the choice of content that you show users, you can have effects on their internal state. And in this case, it's about mood, but like one can imagine the same thing with preferences or beliefs and so on. And it seems very likely that these changes in internal states would like correlate with changes in engagement. So what that means is like, it seems quite likely that being in a specific mood will also have an effect on how engaged you are with the platform. And so in a sense, it seems like there's this theoretical incentive for manipulation is not only present, but it also seems like a very low hanging fruit. So like these systems should be able to manipulate users relatively easily, and that's quite concerning. Okay, so again, like just to reiterate, yeah, even if user manipulation was not already happening, it seems like a quite low hanging fruit in recommender systems. And probably recommender systems is one of the first places in which we'll see AI-driven manipulation happen. So I guess the main takeaway, at least in our research, is that we should try to make an effort to keep a lookout for this. And how would we do so? Well, in part, trying to estimate how the algorithm shifts people's internal states. And then as a second part, like not only we would want to estimate how these internal states, these preferences shift, but also try to determine whether these shifts are manipulative or not, or like problematic in some way. And this, of course, is a very complicated problem. So just to give you an example, say you are given 3 different types of algorithms that here we call policies for recommenders. And these might be generated in different ways. It doesn't really matter too much how they were generated. But you could imagine visualizing how a specific algorithm causes preferences of a user to evolve over time. So you could say, okay, this user initially has got this preference type. And then as time goes on, their preferences evolve in a certain way. And depending on how you ground this preference space, you could say, well, maybe the preferences over here mean that the user prefers sensationalized news, while preferences down here mean that user prefers dry journalism. And you could repeat this type of procedure for many, many different users that you have, and like visualize these preference evolutions over time interacting with this algorithm. And you could have a heat map, a whole heat map, and see, okay, well, for this cohort of users, the preferences ended up like transitioning towards a preference towards sensationalized news, say. So this is like all hypothetical for now. And if you could generate these types of graphs with various algorithms for the same user cohort, so kind of like some counterfactuals, you could essentially see that maybe these graphs would be different. And what that means is that by choosing a specific policy or a specific algorithm to deploy in the real world, you're also choosing a specific way to affect user preferences. Okay, so, and this is probably like this can be quite problematic depending on what type of grounding you have for your preference space. So like you can imagine that if you're choosing a policy or you're choosing an algorithm that is causing people to prefer sensationalized news rather than dry journalism, this is arguably something that people might not want. Yeah. So part of our research has been basically centered around trying to be able to generate these graphs for specific algorithms ahead of time, so without having to deploy them with users. So by basically simulating how the algorithms would affect the user's preferences. So I have some like, I don't know, I guess methodology slides about how we do so. I don't think this is too important, and given that I'm running out of time, I'll just switch through this. But I think maybe, yeah, so one thing we can do essentially with our methodology is, given a specific user trajectory of preferences over time, we see, okay, maybe this user started off here, their preferences shifted in this way according to a specific algorithm pi. And then we can try to simulate how this user's preferences would change according to two different algorithms. So maybe if we continue to have this user interact with a social media algorithm pi, their preferences would continue to evolve in this direction. But if instead we deployed a new recommender system with this user, and this user interacted with pi prime, their preferences would evolve in a very different way. And what this enables you to do is essentially make these graphs that I was mentioning earlier, in which you can essentially look at counterfactuals. Like for the same user, according to the policy or according to the algorithm that I deploy with them, how are their preferences affected? And okay, so I'll just go here. So okay, so if we had this, what could we do? Well, qualitatively, we could just look at these graphs qualitatively and just make value judgments, right? We, like, as system designers or even as users, if we could see these graphs, we could decide, or we could have a judgment of whether we would want this type of recommender system or we would want this other one. If we see that most people their preferences get pushed towards a specific type of preference that we don't want, we probably wouldn't want to use this type of recommender. Okay, so I guess, yeah, again, like just, so there's a question here of, ideally, what kind of preferences would we even want? Or what kind of preference shifts would we even want? What are desirable shifts? In part, maybe we could say, well, we don't want any influence from the recommender system, or we would want to make these, to have our preferences evolve under full information in our own best interest without succumbing to temptation or other type of like cognitive distortions that we might have. And really what we would want is like, I don't know, consider the preference shifts that enlightened users would have. But of course, these type of enlightened users don't actually exist. So in practice, we can't really do that. So anyways, sorry, I'm just trying to skip through because of lack of time. But so what we can settle for is potentially just trying to ignore the effect of the recommender, or like trying to remove as much agency from the recommender system as possible. And one way we can do that is to basically consider a random recommender system. And so if we look at the preferences that would be induced by a random recommender system with like actual users, and we see that the preferences induced by a different algorithm are very different, then this could be like a sign of something going wrong, in the sense that because this means that the recommender system that we're deploying is essentially causing preferences to shift in a very different way from what would be the natural preference evolution of the users. So anyways, so this is just a scratch on the surface of like the types of problems that would arise here. Okay, so I'll just kind of skip through this last part. But I guess just as a summary, like really to solve these types of problems in practice, it will not really be possible to escape answering these philosophical and somewhat political questions of like what manipulation consists of, what type of shifts should be considered manipulative, who gets to decide whether shifts are manipulative or unwanted or problematic. And really any approach that exists out there will answer these questions implicitly. Like even if we don't try to just shy away from them, there will be an answer implicit in what we do. In fact, like the way algorithms are selected currently already right now is basically putting a blindfold on and like choosing whatever maximizes engagement without taking into account the effects on users' preferences, beliefs, and psychological states. And it's likely impossible to address this challenge in a clean, formal way, as we usually would like in research. But the fact that it's going to be messy, like all human systems, doesn't mean that it's not important and necessary. Okay, and yeah, so I guess like the takeaways is by trying to make our value judgment explicit and monitoring these effects of algorithms on preferences directly, like basically just making these graphs potentially, or something along these lines, could enable us to have better conversations about these types of problems, like these philosophical and political problems, and prevent bad outcomes. Yeah, so there's a lot of many open questions that remain. For example, should these algorithms that have clear incentives to manipulate users be legal? That's just maybe one upstream question. And if one says, well, yes, they should be legal, there's still a lot of questions. For example, what safety standards should there be? What should they look like? Should there be any safety standards? Should anybody be able to optimize even like for changing people's beliefs in certain ways, like intentionally setting out to change people's preferences or beliefs? Again, like who should decide what is considered manipulative if we do have like these manipulative algorithms out there? And if we say that these algorithms shouldn't be legal, still there's like, we still have to have recommender systems, or like it doesn't seem likely that we're not going to have any recommender systems at all out there. They just won't be of this manipulative, like directly manipulative kind. But even if you use a non-manipulative recommender system, it will still have an impact on users. And like we still have a lot of open questions about who should decide what content is considered harmful or misinformation or so on, even in current recommender systems. So the problems don't stop there either. And yeah, so that's kind of like an overview of the types of problems that we've been working on in our research. And yeah, these are my wonderful collaborators. And yeah, thank you for listening.
Thank you, Micah. Oh boy, you've given us a lot to think about here. And I see we already have a question from Stuart Usum. Stuart, welcome back to Wonderfest. Stuart, you want to unmute yourself and make yourself the in-person questioner, almost in person?
Thank you, Tucker. Thank you, Micah. I appreciate the presentation. Yeah, I pasted my question into the chat box. I was just wondering if you're aware of this, people trying to game the system and understand the algorithm and fake it out, manipulate the manipulator per se. Thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that that's definitely something that a lot of different parties are interested in doing that. And like, I mean, there's all sorts of like spam bot armies or bot armies that like are organized by countries to try to interfere in other people's elections or like just political processes. And even individuals, like any individual that's trying to build like or trying to sell stuff online has an incentive to try to reverse engineer how the algorithm works in order to get maximum engagement and traction and visibility. So yeah, there's a lot of even content creators on YouTube have entire videos talking about their theories of how the recommender system works and how to optimize their content in order to get maximum visibility. And I think like some of these types of approaches might have some success sometimes, but I do think that like the recommender systems that are used by these big companies are in constant evolution. And I don't think there's really any like strategy that's always going to work, because they're constantly being updated and changed. And And also the systems are just so complicated that I don't think anybody at Facebook or anybody at Twitter would actually even know how to game the systems themselves, at least heuristically. Like maybe if they wrote an algorithm to game this, like if they wrote an algorithm that had access to their algorithm, you might be able to do it. So the short answer is, if you worked at Twitter or at Facebook, maybe you could do it, but otherwise it's very hard. Yeah.
Well, thank you. If I can squeeze in one more, with regard to recommender systems, when you're shopping, it seems like Amazon or what have you certainly is recommending products based on your previous purchases or your browsing, and all those products have recommendations, from other people. I don't know if this is relevant to your work, but I'm wondering how we can trust the recommendation systems these days with regard to the 5-star reviews and things like that.
Yeah, so I think that those are slightly different. I mean, so the recommendations from other users are different from the algorithmic recommendations that I've been talking about. And yeah, trusting like data in recommendation systems is definitely a problem. And that's kind of like goes back to this issue of bots. Like you could have an army of bots that all like fake news posts and like make it seem like these posts are legitimate. But yeah, that's also a very complicated problem that yeah, I don't know. I don't think really we'll have any like clear-cut mathematical solution, or like I don't think any researcher can solve this entirely. Like there has to be content moderation and so on, and yeah, and that's always messy and complicated. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question, Stuart. Jim Stauffer, I see that hand. Great, Jim, please ask your question.
Well, I was curious about relating this to humans who make recommendations, salesmen, car salesmen trying to get you to buy a bunch of bells and whistles and stuff like that. So the machines have the great advantage of massive data and mass and ability to work so fast. But I didn't know if still salesmen are consulted or at least get rated against machines for evaluating them or anything like that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and like generally a really, really good point. Like this type of manipulation or persuasion, one might call it, in maybe a slightly less bad connotation word, like is definitely employed by all of marketing and like, I don't know, like advertising already, like but yeah, I think that there really is a distinction there of like a person setting out to write a persuasive message and like an algorithm that is optimizing for like and like analyzing these vast troves of user data and like finding out hidden patterns in your behavior over the past months on whatever platform to figure out that you are emotionally vulnerable in this way to this type of messaging. And this is similar to what the whole scandal with Cambridge Analytica was, where it's like somewhat related to this, where they were using these types of like access to people's profiles in order to do political messaging that was prying on people's I guess psychological vulnerabilities or like their specific point on the political spectrum with targeted messages. And I think, yeah, the line is blurry, definitely, of like where the ethics are at the various points of the scale. But I think the more you go towards algorithmically driven persuasion, the more it becomes, yeah, I don't know, less clear whether that's really what we want as a society. Yeah. Just because like the harms could be much larger, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Jim, for the question. Thank you, Micah, for your answer. Let me squeeze one in here too. In helping to attract an audience to tonight's presentation, I gave a rather pessimistic quote from Yuval Noah Harari regarding the fate of democracy if our skills and our ethics revolving around algorithms of the sort you're discussing aren't more carefully created. I'm wondering, I'm thinking of an alleged quote from Joseph Goebbels of Nazi fame, perhaps the most accomplished media expert of the 20th century. And Goebbels is alleged to have said, let me get this right, a lie told once remains a lie, but a lie told 1,000 times becomes the truth. And I just got to wonder, humans get tired of telling anything, including lies, but algorithms don't. And I'm just wondering, I don't know, Micah, this is a very tough question, but currently we trust our companies to just want to maximize profits, and sometimes those desires are checked by regulations. But I wonder, in your group of colleagues there at Human Compatible AI, if they do have ideas about who should make these decisions, and you voiced that question prominently, who should make these decisions? Do you imagine a future where a democratic government, we hope still democratic, has to make more decisions that right now are made in corporations?
Yeah, I mean, I think that right now, people call the field, the whole area of AI in industry, like a wild west of sorts. Because there's no or there's very little regulation, or the regulation that there is like very broad, high level schematic, because nobody in the government really knows how these systems work. These systems are currently constantly evolving. And I think the EU has just started writing some AI regulation, so it's like everything is still happening. But yeah, I do think that right now, companies have got far too much power in unilaterally deciding the answers to these questions. And so far, I mean, for all the bad things that have happened or have emerged through social media and so on, I do think that they're doing not the worst job, or they're not actively being adversarial, they're not actively trying to abuse their power too much. But it could be a lot worse. That's really what I'm trying to get at. And it's definitely not great. But yeah, I do hope that in the future there will be, more regulation, and good regulation too. Yeah, and not just over regulating everything immediately. Yeah, I think there's a lot of concern within the field that there will be over-regulation, but I think definitely right now we have the opposite problem. Yeah.
In this wild west of artificial intelligence, it's good to know that there are thoughtful sheriffs of at least small regions like you and Tara to help keep some measure of order and thoughtfulness. So I thank you. And it is time to say goodnight. I want to thank our audience, all you Wondernauts out there, for being here. Great for you to show this kind of curiosity. Thanks for being here. Thank you especially to those of you who have donated to Wonderfest, or perhaps even become regular patrons. You can perform both activities at wonderfest.org, where you'll also learn about Wonderfest's future events, including the Science of Psychedelics in person in Novato on May 30th, and here on Zoom on June 9th concerning the new 30-meter telescope. That's the rather controversial telescope on Mauna Kea in Hawaii. Hope you can make it for one or two of those events. All right, and finally, a really big thank you. Please join me in giving perhaps an American Sign Language silent applause, or make it audible if you want, to our two speakers, Tara Srirangarajan and Micah Carroll. Yay!